In this session, we will be looking at a brief overview of some aspects of the interactions between Native Americans and Christianity. Uh, we, again, are just going to be predominantly very brief in our overview, and it's going to be selective as well. And then finally, of course, it's predominantly going to focus on just aspects of uh, Christianity and Native Americans. We're not going to, there's much more to Native American experience than just Christianity. So I don't want to kind of give the impression that this is the only aspect of Native American religion. Um, Nor are we going to go into a full overview of aspects of that interaction. Specifically, we're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about some of the trauma and the consequences, not only of some of the interactions, but predominantly uh, the political aspect of those interactions with the shunting of Native Americans to reservations and how that uh, really had a significant impact on Native American um culture, as well as the economics of Native Americans and a variety of other things. And so we won't really spend much time talking about either of those, despite there being some very important aspects of that for us as Christians to recognize. Additionally, um, there's some ways in which it would be important for us to recognize that Native American uh, activity prior to encounter with Europeans, as well as after encounter with Europeans, is a largely one of diversity, in the sense that there was so much diversity prior to colonization, and there was continued diversity after colonization. Um, so, in one sense, we can overgeneralize, um, and I think that certainly that does somewhat of a disservice. But considering the short amount of time we have to discuss the entirety of American Christianity, we just don't have a long time to go into all the Native American experiences, not only prior to Christianity, but even after Christianity. So, with those kind of statements in the forefront, we will try to say some things. Again, some of this will be overly generalistic, and it is necessarily selective of that. I do want to say a little bit, um, even though the purpose of this course is to look at the history of American Christianity. I do want to set the stage a little bit by talking about what the practice, or at least to think a little bit about the over generalized characteristics of indigenous peoples in the Americas prior to colonization. Now, that's with a recognition that we have very little information. What has been um, discovered fits into a variety of facets. There is some information that we have that is contemporaneous. Certainly, a lot of that is from outsiders, people that tended to be hostile. So, for example, Spanish and French missionaries talking about native practices, usually very hostile towards native religions. Understandably so, right? As Christians, looking at some of the traditions natives would have been involved in, would have been very judgmental about those practices. So it's not a surprise that we get this negative outlook, but it does provide us with a difficulty because it is the primary outlook we have. Not a lot of literacy prior to colonization. So we don't have written records. We do have some certainly traditions that were shared with missionaries, and then later on with governmental officials of the United States government. And I don't want to diminish that, because the importance of, in these oral societies, of passing along tradition often was pretty reliable, but even there we don't have a lot of information. There certainly is some archaeological record that is available to scholars. So that provides us some information, but certainly there are some aspects where we can point to certain discoveries, and archaeologists are able to make educated guesses and interpretations of that archaeological evidence, but still there are some gaps because of the lack of a written record, which means that it makes it kind of difficult to look back at some of these situations, look back at the information that we have, and think about what life was like prior to contact. Now, there are a couple of things that we can suggest prior to contact. One of those is, as we've already mentioned, it was a very diverse situation. Scholars have estimated that at the time of contact, there were about 15 million inhabitants in what we call North America. Certainly a lot less than what is here presently, but still a sizable number of people. We believe, based on the evidence, that they were divided into about 550 different native societies. Some of those we sometimes call tribes, but that can also include clans and some other different ways of organizing. So, a pretty diverse population. Yes, there was some overlap as different groups maybe shared the same space, as different groups engaged in confederations between their organization and others. So there would have been places of overlap and similarity, but also places for quite a bit of difference. There were 5 different language groups, or major language groups, the way that ethnographers and others have kind of divided that up. But still, even within those major groups, there would have been variations as well. So we have a wide variety of diversity that makes it difficult to try and present any sort of clear picture in a short amount of time that really does justice to the way things were. Having said that, I do want to try and make a couple of generalizations that to some extent are broadly found across native societies to the best of our knowledge. Again, this is with the caveat that even with these characteristics, there would have been a lot of variation. And there would have been some things that were present in only certain groups that would have not been present in others. But what are some characteristics, or what were some characteristics that we can see across different groups at this time? Pretty important across the board for most native groups in the Americas were ideas of kinship and reciprocity. Kinship, of course, is important in a lot of different groups, not just indigenous groups in the Americas, but very important throughout a lot of these tribes and other clans, etc., was the importance of recognizing and how you recognized who you were connected with, whether that was in kind of the way we think of as a related to situation of, brother, sister, uncles, aunts, as well as maybe some societies or clans where The biological relationship might not be as strong, but you were still connected with these people. Kinship was very important, the recognizing of others of your group and how you recognized others of your group. Certainly there were variations with some aspects, some groups being patrilineal and others being matrilineal. What I mean by that is not so much the idea of rule, or what's sometimes referred to as patriarchy, but lineage. So patrilineal groups would have traced their lineage, or their kinship would have been based off of the father's line. And so who your most important relatives were was based off of your father's relatives, while some tribes were matrilineal in that they traced their lineage through their mother. So in a matrilineal society, again, that's not where the women rule, but where you trace your lineage through. In a matrilineal society, your most important male relative would have been your mother's brother, where, at a patrilineal society, it would have been slightly different. But still, the kinship was very important in thinking about your identity, in thinking about the relationships you had and the activities that you were involved in. Kind of connected with that was the notion of reciprocity, in that society was organized or was maintained by a variety of notions of reciprocal relationships between individuals. So that if I provide you a gift or some type of benefit, the expectation is that you will return that benefit or that gift or a similar gift to me. And so these notions of reciprocity were very important for thinking how society was organized. And of course, with colonization, a lot of that was disrupted in that these reciprocal relationships weren't understood as well by Europeans, and so that caused some impact with the ways in which tribes operated. Very important for most Native American tribes was the idea of ritual. In Christianity, we tend to focus on beliefs, especially those of us shaped by Protestantism. While we certainly think practice is important, a lot of what we think Christianity is about tends to be the notion of beliefs. These are the correct beliefs to have. And even when it comes to practices or ritual, we think about, the right ideas about ritual. For Native societies, beliefs were important. And I don't want to say there was an absence of beliefs, but beliefs were always less important than ritual. And you'll find some other societies and religions like this where the ritual component is what is most important and what tends to predominate. Rituals were, they were important not just for, personal type of spirituality, but also important for thinking about the survival of the tribe. That could be kind of an emotional, psychological survival. It could be physical survival, right? You engaged in certain rituals so that there might be enough game for the tribe to continue to live on. Rituals provided order, provided identity, as you engaged in different rituals that were part of a tribal identity or a society identity. You might be initiated into a specific society, and you would undergo a certain set of rituals. And so ritual tended to be much more important than a certain set of beliefs. And rituals tended to be, it tended to be that you had to, that it wasn't just performing the rituals, but performing the rituals in the right way to bring about the appropriate result. Sometimes rituals allowed for individual variation. Others, it was required that you perform it exactly. For example, when it comes to something like Navajo sand painting, where you would create a painting of the holy people through different colored sand grains to not create it in the appropriate way, to not, have the right symbols, etc., could bring about, bad results through the activity of evil type of holy people when you're trying to engage those that are going to be beneficial. So ritual would be a very important component across different tribes. Additionally, there tended to be notions of wholeness and chaos. Most tribes thought of their organization, right? So you think about a tribe living together. Within that unit, um, which tended to be shaped in a circle. Circles tended to be pretty important for how a community might organize itself. Within the circle is the forces of wholeness. Outside are the forces of chaos. Ritual meant to continue to shape those boundaries. But of course, when you think of something like colonization, here come the forces of chaos from outside the circle, and then invading the wholeness within it, causing a variety of things, disruption in a variety of ways. And some of that disruption was physical. Certainly, we'll talk a little bit about some religious disruption, but here we have, the major impact of colonization in those early years being the death of Native Americans. A lot of them dying from a variety of things. Disease, of course, was the major way of large numbers of Native Americans died. They were just not ready, were not prepared, did not physically have the ability to fight a variety of European diseases that were brought over unintentionally, but then there was also intentional efforts to afflict natives with disease. But disease was the largest way that a lot of Native Americans died. Enslavement also led frequently to death. Certainly there were efforts in those early years to enslave Native Americans. Not all situations, but in some cases there were attempts to enslave Native Americans. That tended to not work as successfully as African slavery did, predominantly because Native Americans tended to be able to escape at times and be able to hide out in the area or leave the area because they knew it a little bit better than the Europeans did. African slaves, of course, were at a disadvantage of being in a completely different situation. And so, they weren't as able to escape as Native Americans were, but enslavement still led to death, sometimes from the conditions of slavery and sometimes from just being, part of the work of slavery. And then certainly violence and warfare was a part of the interactions between Europeans and Native Americans frequently at various times, and that led to death as well. So a large part of those early centuries was essentially kind of destroying that diversity or, depopulating the number of people that were present in the Americas. I want to turn now to talking about some of the efforts that were made, particularly by Catholics during this period. That's not to necessarily condemn Catholics or anything, but they're the first ones to come to the Americas to interact with Native Americans, come to the Americas from Europe to interact with Native Americans, attempt to Christianize them, along with, there is so much else that's going on with colonization, which should not be minimized. But the focus of this class, of course, is American Christianity, so we're going to tend to focus on those aspects related to specifically mission efforts. And we're going to basically look at two different attempts, not the only attempts, but two different attempts to Christianize the Native Americans. First with the Spanish in Central and South America and southwestern United States, what's now the southwestern United States, and largely driven by the Spanish, although certainly in South America the Portuguese were involved as well. And then we're going to turn to and talk about the French in Canada, or New France at the time. One of the most prevalent ways that the Spanish interacted with Native Americans in Central and South America was the development of missions. Essentially, these Spanish-like towns that were developed in various places to try and Christianize the Native Americans. Perhaps the most famous mission in America is in San Antonio, a picture here of the Alamo. Missions developed in a variety of places. In 1620, there were 44 missions in Florida. The oldest, coming in the 1500s, is believed to be St. Augustine, Florida. But there were other places in Florida that developed as well. Also in the southwest of the United States, in 1750, there were 22 missions in Arizona and New Mexico. And by the 1760s, they were moving up the coast of California. In thinking about efforts to reach Native Americans, I'm going to be focusing predominantly on a group of Spanish missionaries known as the Franciscans. We mentioned in the session on European backgrounds about the mendicant orders that developed in the later Middle Ages. The Franciscans, after Francis of Assisi, were one of those mendicant orders that developed. They were not the only Spanish missionaries. There were other orders that were present as well. But they serve as a good example of some efforts to try, of at least one type of effort to missionize. And with the Franciscans, there tended to be more of an effort to essentially force conversion. Now, when it came to the Franciscan views, largely from Francis and the views that Francis established, the importance of purity, was a significant component of their outlook. But one became pure, or was purified, through an ascetic outlook, through ascetic practices. Ascetic lifestyle, leading a very simple lifestyle. Franciscans, of course, took vows of poverty, vows of chastity, and other things to lead a very simple life, believing that kind of if you punish the body, you'll gain all these spiritual benefits because you're so focused on spiritual things, not physical things. And that was a large part of how they approached their missionary efforts as well. Another important part of the Spanish efforts related to conversion, especially in the early years, was the practice of Encomienda. Encomienda was essentially a plan that would bring about the colonization of the Americas by Spanish individuals. Certainly the Spanish Empire believed, and it tended to be the practice at the time, that if you could populate an area with your citizens, that area would have a more likely, it would be more likely that it would be recognized that was part of your empire. And so Encomienda was a process devised to colonize the New World, to bring about people to the American continent but also was a way in which there were efforts to bring about conversion of Native Americans. And so theoretically, this was about converting Native Americans as well. The way that worked was that basically potential settlers were given tracts of land, and out of that, they were to instruct the natives in that on that land in Catholicism, and teach them to be Christian. And there were some ways in which that was variously offered, but in many respects, with that was the granting by the Spanish Empire that the Native Americans could be forced into servitude. That you not only would you get the land, but you were given the forced labor of any of the Native Americans on that land as well, with the requirement of teaching them in Catholicism. Well, the lived experience was there was a lot of slavery and forced servitude. There was very little instruction in Catholicism. And eventually the Encomienda system was done away with, was made illegal by the Spanish Empire. But for a while, this was the way in which the Spanish attempted to colonize parts of the Americas. And Christianity was deeply intertwined with that. Another component of the Spanish efforts, as we've mentioned already, was the use of missions. Now, essentially, the missions, as we mentioned previously, were the recreation of these Spanish villages, Spanish towns, Spanish culture, that natives would then be forced to live in by the Spanish, and essentially, some of the ideas were that they would be forced to learn the Spanish language, they would be forced to adopt Spanish customs, Spanish lifestyles, essentially trying to make the Native Americans Spanish, which would include instruction in Catholicism, making them Catholic. Now, again, I keep emphasizing or referring to Catholicism being tied up with this. That is not to suggest that Catholics would necessarily have been different than other types of Christianity. It's just that they were Catholic. And so that's how Christianity is tied up in this. And so it's not to, make Catholicism, seem more violent than other forms of Christianity, but it certainly this expression of Christianity at this time in this way was. Now, there were a couple of things that took place with the use of missions, or how the Franciscans used missions in order to bring about conversion. One of those was, or one of the ways missions worked was that it essentially inverted the social order that was so important to Native American civilizations. So, for example, the missions were frequently built on top of shrines or very holy places for Native Americans. We talked earlier about the idea of wholeness and chaos. Right, that wholeness is found within the circle, the village, the community, and the forces of chaos are without. They're outside that. Well, so what the mission effort was to build these mission towns in the very center of Native American villages, Native American tribes, and essentially the forces of chaos are now present in the center of the wholeness, right? So it's disrupting, intentionally or otherwise. There's a question as to how much the Spanish actually understood what they were doing. There were some aspects they understood. But for Native Americans, of course, this is kind of really upsetting a lot of their social order. Additionally, one of the efforts of the Franciscans was to elevate or give status to the younger people in various tribes and villages over their elders. Now, within a lot of Native American culture, the elders were, of course, very, very highly respected. And so, they were the ones that were looked up to. They were the ones that made the decisions, and the younger were expected to follow that. Well, what the Franciscans did was to begin to elevate the status of younger people. So, for example, giving gifts to younger people. Sometimes that would be children. Other times it would be just some younger adults. And as if you remember, we talked about the importance of reciprocity. Well, in the process of gift giving, it created a relationship and a responsibility between the younger people of the tribe and the Franciscans. So again, that's kind of one giving preference to the younger. Another way that this was done was to when one of the things that the Franciscans liked to do was to create plays or enact plays to teach truths of Catholicism, of Christianity. And they would give the good roles to the younger people in the community and give bad roles to the elders. So, for example, very popular plays in the Middle Ages and later were these plays where virtues and vices were kind of personified. So an actor would kind of enact a virtue or enact a vice. Well, all the virtues or the roles of virtues went to the younger people. All the roles of vices went to the elders. Again, kind of setting up this conflict between younger and elder, as well as kind of providing these connections to the missionaries. Another emphasis of the Franciscan approach was to engage Native Americans through visual means. As I mentioned just a little bit ago, one of the things they tried to do was essentially make the natives Spanish. So there wasn't a lot of effort by missionaries to attempt to learn about native cultures or native languages, except to try and make them Spanish, which meant that there was often a language barrier between the two groups. Furthermore, there are some concepts within Christianity that did not translate well to Native American cultures. And this was true not just for the Spanish, but for the English and for the French as well. So approaching the faith and the transmission of the faith was better accomplished, the Franciscans felt, through visual means. So, using material objects, statues, paintings, things like that, engaging in the use of symbols, were all efforts to try and communicate Christianity to a group of people that did not share the same language, and trying to address some of the language barriers that existed between the different groups. So largely, the efforts of the Spanish were very much ascetical, involved the use of forced labor and the granting of large tracts of lands, and engaged in inversion of the social order, attempting to make Native Americans Spanish. There was slightly different approaches by the French in the New World. And of course, this would be more in Canada rather than New Spain being in Central and South America. Much of the efforts by the French were undertaken by a group known as the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus. This was a group, an organization that had developed in around the same time as the Reformation, much more militaristically focused, and so had some slightly different approaches. And in many respects, the Jesuits were less about forced conversion and more about persuasion. And there were a couple of things that were connected with that made them different than the Spanish Franciscans. One is that they were French, not Spanish. Now, that might seem kind of obvious, right? We're talking about the French. But what that meant was there was less of a connection to the Pope and the papacy as there was for the Spanish. The Spanish had very close ties with the papacy at this time. The French were not as close to the papacy. And so there's differences here in how they are Catholic, right? And what they see as their connection with the papacy and the leadership. So there's that difference. Additionally, when the French came to what today is Canada, what then became known as New France at the time, they didn't come with the same amount and the same militaristic presence as the Spanish did. Right? So the French don't have the same numbers of troops and militaristic power that the Spanish did. And so that really has an impact on their efforts as well. So the Jesuits tended to, in New France, tended to focus on learning the languages of the Native Americans. A lot of them predominantly focused on the Iroquois, although there were some efforts with some other tribes as well. So learning the language, learning the culture, still very, very concerned, upset about the culture, looking at these non-Christian cultures and some of the practices they engaged in, and so there was a lot of concern about that, but there was still an effort to learn that. And additionally, the Jesuits lived among the tribes, and so kind of spread out through New France instead of bringing Native Americans to these mission towns, these mission villages. All right, so they kind of lived among the people to a little bit more extent than the Franciscans did. Additionally, the Jesuits had some slightly different views of what it meant to be Catholic, and some of the things about what were the most important things. For them, obedience was very, very important. Not that it wasn't for the Franciscans, but much more a part of what it meant to be the Jesuit than it did to be a Franciscan. Also very important for the Jesuits was education. And they if you were going to be a Jesuit, you spent a lot of time in education, but in attempting to evangelize the tribes, they put a heavy premium on education, setting up schools and other things throughout New France that were focused on education. And they were also very heavily integrated in thinking about discipline and the importance of discipline. So in many respects, they had a slightly different outlook. And what's interesting about the Jesuits is the Jesuits kept some really detailed records of their times in New France, known as this series of documents known as the Jesuit Relations, where these different priests that were throughout the region would, record interactions with Native Americans, kept some very interesting records. Now, even here, some of them have to be taken very carefully, right? Because these are Catholic priests writing about non-Christian Native Americans, right? So, there's that hostility to some extent. There is a way in which the Jesuits are trying to, these are being written not just for record keeping, but they're being sent back to Europe and published for people to read. So in a sense, they're trying to promote the work that's being done in New France. And so, there's that component. It's not just this objective, detached recording. There's an effort here to kind of promote what's being done in New France as well. But it does provide us really with some good insight into some of the priests at the time, some of their activities, different things that the Jesuits were doing in New France. There's records connected with the Franciscans as well in New Spain, but certainly not to the same extent as the Jesuit relations are for New France. And so this provides us, I think, with a good distinction between these various attempts by missionaries to evangelize, and so slightly different views on how you approach that, how you how you engage in thinking about not only colonizing but evangelizing as well. There were a couple of other things where we see the expression of Christianity, not just in missionary efforts, but in a variety of rituals and activities that not just missionaries, but soldiers and others engaged in the process of colonization. And so, as the French, as the the Spanish, eventually the Dutch, and the English and others, as they came to these various places, not only did they attempt to Christianize the people, but there was a way in which they're trying to Christianize the land itself. And so there's a lot of discussion of this notion of possessing the land, taking control of the land. That was done through a variety of rituals that essentially, by engaging in these rituals, which, steeped in Christianity, that essentially what they're trying to do is kind of lay claim to this land. And they did it in different ways. Now, our focus, of course, has been on the Spanish and the French because of the time period. But when the English come over, one of the ways they attempted to ritually possess the land was through the use of fences and gardens, the building of homes, plantations, kind of the effort or the idea being they are laying claim to the soil, ritualistically laying claim to the soil. And a lot of this has to do with English ideas of property and culturation, right? That, you're a cultured society if you have a home and a garden fenced in. Natives didn't think of land or property that way, but the English are coming in and they're kind of taking over these plots of land, and they're kind of claiming, right, this is mine, and it's mine because I've built a house here and I've fenced in the land. And that's not necessarily something that that Native Americans would have completely understood. For the French, it was, erecting crosses, putting up cross, emphasized, right? This is a Christian land. They would engage in ceremonies, processions, all sorts of other types of activities that sometimes Native Americans would be forced into. And it was all about, laying claim to the land, the people, the power that supposedly resided with that. As far as ritualistic approaches by the Spanish, one of the major ones was the reading of the requirement. Now, the requirement was a document that basically laid out a judgment, so to speak, a pronouncement upon the native people that basically called them to surrender to the Spanish forces, to become Catholic and accept the rule of Spain. And it was this rather elaborate document that basically kind of said, God has given his authority through to Christ. Christ gave his authority to Peter. Peter's given his authority to the Pope, and now the Spanish, with the authority of the Pope, have the right to make claim to these lands. And if you don't surrender and become Catholic, we are going to come in and we're going to destroy you all. Now, there were some ethical problems with the requirement itself, in the sense that, in the enacting of it, in that it was read in Spanish, which the natives, of course, didn't understand Spanish. It was often read very quickly, right? So even if you had some knowledge of Spanish, it's difficult to understand when somebody speaks quickly. And sometimes it was even done at night when nobody was there to hear it. So, a lot of natives didn't have the opportunity to kind of say, okay, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And then make a decision whether they wanted to or not, accept what was being said. That a lot of these Spanish officers felt like, well, we just need to do it. We don't necessarily need to give the people the opportunity to respond to it. And so, it was this, it was not done in good faith. In addition to larger problems of colonialism, the actual act wasn't done much in good faith. So, were missionaries successful? Well, one of the things that we find difficult in looking back here, from a Christian standpoint, is one of the things we would like to know is the interior, right? What was the interior disposition, right? There were natives that were baptized. There were natives that adopted Christian customs, claimed a Christian identity. But I think probably a lot of Christians today would want to know, okay, well, are they doing this just to kind of save themselves and their tribes, perhaps, or are they doing this because they're actually convinced, right? There's an interior disposition here. They're actually convinced of the truth of Christianity. Well, we can't know that. That information is not available to us. But what we do see is a way in which a lot of missionaries and natives attempted to find some sort of middle ground, right? To work together to find a middle ground between these two groups, with priests often finding, trying to find ways to express Christianity in ways that could be understood. So native rituals, the native calendar, right? Certain ceremonies being done at certain times of the year, certain native words being incorporated into Christianity. Trying to find a way to take those words and connect them with, um, Christian concepts. Essentially, what we do see is kind of this, what we might call hybridity, other people might call syncretism, where there is kind of this combination, a melding of Christianity and native ideas. Kind of setting up a notion, for example, of saying, okay, here, these natives have these holy people. Well, these holy people are actually, or we can connect them with, Mary and the saints, right? And so you have this holy person, well, let's connect it with this saint. So you have this kind of hybridity that develops. So some people very likely accepted Catholicism or were coerced enough into Catholicism. Others had this more hybrid type of notion that developed that they accepted. And then certainly others rejected it altogether. And this ambiguity of what took place and what this reflects and was there success, and how's this really reflect, is this truly Catholicism, is this truly Christianity here when we have this kind of hybrid notion? Well, the same kind of ambiguity is reflected in notions of Native Americans. And there was just a lot of ambiguity for missionaries. And some of that reflected in how they viewed Native Americans. Some people viewed Native Americans as these noble innocents. Here are these people who have been shut off from Western society, right? This is the first time Western culture has kind of encountered these people, at least in the minds of, the Spanish, the French, etc. Certainly there are some questions as to whether there had been some Nordic peoples in the Americas, possibility of Africans in the Americas prior to the Spanish. But for our purposes, the assumption is here are these people that have been shut off from the Western world, from the Christian civilization, and they live these rather simple lifestyles. They're close to nature. They don't know the temptations and the troubles of life, right? And so these are noble innocents. The noble savage is the way that it was often presented. And so this kind of positive view of natives, certainly still the idea of they need to be Christianized, but these are noble people. They're innocent of the great terrors and horrors and evils of the world. On the other hand, for some people, it was, well, no, they're heathens. Right? You look at them, then there's some instances of human sacrifice and ritualistic cannibalism. There's they're not reflecting morality, Christian morality, in sexual morality, all sorts of things. And so for some people, they're noble innocents. For others, they're heathens. And there's just really just this ambiguity as to, who these people are and how do we understand them. And the same kind of thing was connected with their rituals. There were some people that looked at some of the rituals of Native Americans and believed that there were some similarities to some of the things that natives did and Christian practices, Christian rituals. And so here are these people. They are practicing some of these things. Has had an apostle visited them. The Bible only records the activity of some apostles. So maybe there was an apostle that visited them, right? So all these efforts to try and explain, why are there these similarities? Well, some taking a more positive outlook, said, well, perhaps these people are lost tribes of Israel. Right? There are the 10 northern tribes that go into captivity with the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE, and we don't know what happened to them. Perhaps these Native Americans are lost tribes of Israel. Now, again, a large part of this is being done prior to any sort of anthropological understanding of who Native Americans are. So there's no theories of land bridges and migration and understanding of descent, and trying to think about, the connection between Native peoples and perhaps peoples in Asia. So, there's a lot of that kind of knowledge that doesn't exist at the time. So basically, they are left with kind of the Bible, and so the Bible is providing them information about where these people come from. And so one of the things they believe is, these are lost tribes of Israel, and that's why there's some similarity here between what they do and what we do, because they have that background that's kind of it's stayed with them, but over the years it's kind of been corrupted. Because certainly they don't practice it the way we practice it. Well, others didn't take that more positive route. Instead, they took a more negative route and claiming, well, no, this is not a holdover from having at one time proper practice and it's been corrupted over the centuries. No, this is demonic imitation. That what has happened here is Satan and the demons have encouraged these people to practice these corrupted forms of Christianity. So the devil has presented to them, this kind of notion of these practices, and that's why they look like Christianity, is because the devil has kind of encouraged this perverted approach to Christian practices. In many respects, demons were very, very real to Europeans at the time. They believed in witchcraft. They believed in demonic activity. And we'll talk a little bit about that with the Puritans and the Salem witch trials. And we've talked a little bit about that already with the beliefs of magic and the supernatural in the European background session. But, these are very real things that take place, and the demons are very active. And so for a lot of Christians, the devil was active in the New World, and that was seen in some of these practices that were kind of corrupt. Well, let's kind of take that and pull it all together in looking at a case study. Now, in many respects, as we've mentioned before, there's a lot of diversity among Native Americans, especially when it comes to Christianity, the acceptance or rejection of Christianity. But I think that using the Iroquois is a good way to think about some of the things and some of the ways Native Americans approached it. And the Iroquois have a good archaeological record, provides us some good information. There's the Iroquois, of course, are one of the tribes that are recorded about in the Jesuit relations. That's an important or an aspect of it that I think is very interesting and can be very helpful in us thinking about the various ways that natives addressed Christianity. So prior to contact, the Iroquois, there's very much a reciprocal relationship between the Iroquois and among the Iroquois. One example of that is the practice of the dream guessing ritual, where when you had dreams, which were considered to be these deep desires, you would engage in kind of performing your dream, pantomiming your dream, getting other people of the tribe to guess what you had dreamt, and then trying to fulfill that. So, for example, if you dreamt you got a new knife, you couldn't just come out and say, hey, I dreamt I got a new knife. You would maybe act out your dream, pantomime it, and people would guess it. And if once they guessed it, they would be responsible for providing you with a new knife. And then, of course, later on down the line, you would be kind of responsible for fulfilling somebody else's dream. Right? So there's notion of reciprocity. There's the individual, right? The dream is the individual dream, but then also the connection with the community. There was also, these were matrilineal societies, right? We talked about that previously, the idea about you trace your lineage, your kinship through your mother's side. And that's kind of reflected in the myth of the three sisters, which is about, Sky Woman falls through a hole in the sky. She's pregnant. As she's falling, the various animals of the sea gather up land for her to fall to, and Turtle agrees to bear it on his back. She falls to earth. She gives birth, and then to twins, and then dies, and her body is buried, and out of her grave come the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, which are, of course, very important staples to the Iroquois diet. But you see kind of, the importance of women in all of this, and their connection with food and the soil, etc. Right? So that's kind of very briefly, kind of some brief overviews of pre-contact. So once the Iroquois and particularly French Jesuits encounter each other, there are some different things that take place. Certainly, as we've talked about already, there is the efforts by the Jesuits to talk about or attempt to convert Native Americans, as we've talked about. So there's the attempts at conversions, but we begin to see ways in which Christianity influences Iroquois beliefs and even stories without necessarily causing conversion. So, for example, the Iroquois were made up of 5 tribes, and so each of the tribes had some identity of itself, but then also had the collective idea of the Iroquois. Well, as this myth develops about how the Iroquois became the Iroquois, how they became the League of the Iroquois, the stories that are told are stories that have this Christian element to it. All right, so the story is that the peacemaker goes through, and he is the one that brings together the Iroquois. But when you look at the story, right, there's a lot of focus on Christian elements, right? He's the peacemaker. He's rejected by his people. There are things that he does, that he's born of a virgin. He speaks his message of peace, and a couple of other things that are very much in line with making this person Christ-like. So here is this myth, this story, that is meant to connect the Iroquois together. And so it tells about the way the nations of the Iroquois are connected, but it's clearly set up or clearly reflects Christian influence, even though it's still predominantly, Iroquois. It's still predominantly native. So you have these kind of influences that begin to come up. Now, certainly there were some people like Kateri Tekakwitha, who just recently became a saint in the Catholic Church, who appear to have adopted the of Catholicism. So Kateri Tekakwitha, Tekakwitha is her native name. When she is baptized in the Catholic Church, she takes the name Kateri. That's her baptismal name. Baptismal name, Catherine, is what it would be, maybe more anglicized. She is a Mohawk, so one of the tribes of the Iroquois, and she has lost a large portion of her family to smallpox, and so she kind of becomes very orphaned. This is this juncture between her and the rest of the tribe, so much so that she is open to the teachings of the Jesuits. She is baptized, and then becomes this very intensely devout Catholic. Becomes a nun, is known for a lot of devout practice. Right, so it appears that she is very much Catholic. Right, that she is one who is completely converted. Not that there weren't others, but this is one example of somebody that is converted. She is beatified in 1980. Beatified is somebody is known as the blessed someone, so in the blessed Kateri Tekakwitha. And it's the first step to being a saint, and then she is a canonized. She was made a saint in 2012. One of the things that is a part of the process of becoming a saint is the two miracles are to be attributed to someone. A boy in the 18th century was supposedly healed by a piece of Kateri's coffin. There are other claims of healings and cures, but the one that kind of puts it over the top is in 2006, a boy in Washington State who was half Native American survived a flesh-eating bacterium, and his parents are he gets this. His parents are told he's going to die. His parents pray to Kateri, and a bone fragment of hers is placed beside him, and it supposedly causes the infection to stop progressing. All right, so that's the second miracle that is attributed to her. Right, so that's part of the ways in which her process of canonization took place. So one example you have here of somebody who appears to have fully embraced Catholicism. There are questions about that. There are Native Americans today who have kind of adopted Tekakwitha as an example, but of Native American identity and not her Catholic identity. So there's some questions even today about this, but it appears to be, on the one hand, somebody who converts. But that doesn't mean that was the only way people approached Christianity. I'll give you, so Kateri in the 17th century, here's an example of somebody in the 19th century. Now, in the 19th century for the Iroquois, alcoholism was rampant, and alcoholism has been a problem that Native Americans have faced across a lot of the United States, Canada, and so it's largely as an outgrowth of the colonial process. That was one of the consequences of that. But around 1800, society was very stricken by this, very fragmented, led to fragmented families. A lot of the native culture rituals had been discarded. People are very suspicious of each other, and there's even rumors of witchcraft taking place, right? So there's, within the Iroquois, there are a lot of problems and a lot of, challenges and difficulties. And so it's in the midst of this that a man named Handsome Lake begins sharing a message that is meant to kind of bring the people back together. And what is important about Handsome Lake for our purposes, I mean, Handsome Lake is not strictly a Christian, but some of his message represents the influence of Christianity. Handsome Lake was half-brother to a man named Corn Planter, who was a Iroquois leader at the time, so he does have a connection with some leadership. And in the year 1799, Handsome Lake, who is alcoholic, collapses and appears to die. But essentially, probably we would say he goes into a coma. And in that coma, he has the first of several visions that he will have, that he will then use to try to bring some wholeness to Iroquois society. The first vision, which takes place while he's in this coma, is that, and in each of these he claims that the Creator has spoken to him. And in the first vision, 3 people in traditional Native American dress appear to him and basically warn him that he is to give up alcohol or he will die. Right? And so this kind of calling him as a prophet. But one of the things that's interesting about this first vision connected with Christianity is that he is told that the witches among the Iroquois must repent and confess their sins. Repentance, confessing of sins are not Iroquois concepts. These are Christian concepts. So there's been some influence here of Christianity, even though, Handsome Lake he's calling people back to traditional ideas and practices, but it's not really traditional because it's been influenced by Christianity. So, already here you can see that there is, there's this idea or this melding that's taking place between traditional views and Christian views. In Handsome Lake's second vision, he takes a tour of heaven and hell. And in that, he meets 2 people that are pretty interesting. One is George Washington. So here you have the influence of America, right, in the American political sphere. Washington is just outside heaven, right? He's not in heaven, he's just outside. So it does kind of reflect some native views about the political aspects of the United States. But he also meets Jesus, and Jesus is still bearing the marks of the crucifixion, which in this sense, Lake says, he's bearing the marks of crucifixion because of his people, right? So it's kind of like Christians are not living up to what they claim to, and this is essentially kind of re-crucified Christ. In this vision, Handsome Lake is given Gaiweo, which translates to something like the good message, right? This is the message that he is to give, and it's a message against drunkenness, witchcraft, promiscuity, the abuse of wives, quarreling, gambling. There's a lot of things, like a lot of morality tied up here. Of course, there's some similarity here between the good message and the gospel, which is good news. But of course, Jesus being an important figure in here also suggests the influence of Christianity. But in his third vision, he's instructed to keep the traditional ceremonies, which he then shares with the people. So it's not a Christian religion that's developing here, but it is shaped by Christianity. And there is an apocalyptic notion here of, if the ceremonies are not performed, the world is going to be destroyed. Well, out of these visions and the acceptance of these visions, Lake essentially becomes an Iroquois prophet. People turn to him for guidance, some spiritual guidance. He does have some political effort as well. He travels to Washington, D.C. and speaks with President Jefferson about some matters pertaining to the Iroquois. He will go on to have a variety of other visions over the course of 15 years. And while he is, adopting this traditional revivalism, he really becomes obsessed with witch hunting. He's against the traditional medicine societies, actually kills some of the people connected with that. So again, it's not fully traditional. It is certainly not very much Christian, but some sort of hybrid that is developing here. He wasn't completely against all Christians. We talked about Jesus bearing the marks of the crucifixion from his people. He does believe that the Quakers had some things right. The Quakers were less likely to have more colonial ideas because they were kind of a persecuted minority. So, not that he wants to become a Quaker, not that he's saying the Quakers are absolutely right, but he does think that they do have some things right, particularly the emphasis the Quakers had on the family unit, gender relations, right? Those things were, some areas where the Quakers were right. Other things Handsome Lake preached against or talked against were land sales, very disturbed by Iroquois who were selling their land to Americans, to Anglo-Americans, people of the United States, and also very opposed to those Iroquois that were part of or involved in the U.S. military at this time, and so that was another aspect as well. And what's interesting also is that the Handsome Lake religion develops around the same time as we will talk about the Second Great Awakening. So there's a lot of religious revival taking place in the United States in Christianity, and it's at this same time that Handsome Lake starts preaching his good message. Now, there's certainly more to Iroquois religion and the influence of Christianity than just Cateri-Tekakwitha and Handsome Lake. But I want to talk a little bit about what's it like for the Iroquois today. Well, the Iroquois today, very highly politicized, active in native rights, attempting to get more rights for Native Americans, try to address some of the difficulties, the challenges of even today, the remainders of colonialism. You have some that practice the religion of Handsome Lake. You have many that practice Christianity. But even then, there's divisions. There's some that are Catholic, some that are Protestant. So there's some tensions there. There's also not many, but there are some that are Seventh-day Adventists. So you have a lot of differences religiously among the Iroquois. And that plays out in some other ways as well. There are some that are very pro-gambling, the gambling on reservations, others that are very anti-gambling. Uh, and those that are anti-gambling tend to root it in religious views, whether that's Christian or not, in that, appropriate use of the land, what this does to the sacredness of the land, etc. And of course, from a Christian standpoint, being opposed to some things related to gambling. There are differences about whether the Iroquois should assimilate to the culture of the United States or whether they should maintain the reservation lifestyle, the separatist lifestyle. And so there's Christians and people that follow the Handsome Lake religion that are divided about that as well. And a lot of that is not just religious but political. So religion, in a lot of ways, has always been very strategic for the Iroquois. It's very much a part of kind of this the strategy. Um, that it's a strategic decision as well. So hopefully, I think that gives us a good understanding of some elements of Native American religion, Native American Christianity, the impact and the interrelationship that has taken place between them. And certainly there's a lot more that could be said, and there's a lot more that's been done, excellent scholarly work out there about different tribes, about hybridity, about all sorts of things that we could spend some more time on. But unfortunately, that is the time we have, and so that does bring this session to a close.